leads into my next question, and that regards open access and the open resources and the tools that it enables. How do you think that's going to impact scholarly publishing?
Well, I think it has had an impact on scholarly publishing. I think we've seen more and more individual scholars at least be aware of this issue. Obviously, their responsibility is to get grants, to conduct research, to produce quality education, classroom learning, and it's always surprising to them when we educate them around their ability to control their intellectual property, that they actually can request a different license, that they can actually alter the license that they signed with a publisher. I think publishers have realized that that either through institutional policies or federal funding agency policies, this is shifting. I think that's going to have an impact on research papers. I think it's going to have less of an impact on the scholarly monograph because they generally don't involve funding, external funding. I think there's a parent revolt around the cost of textbooks. I think it bubbled up very slowly, but I think there's a pretty deep anger among parents and students around what they have to pay. And so I think there's going to be a pretty robust open educational resource strategy developed over the next 5 to 10 years.
How do you think that's going to impact the economic model?
I think it will have a tremendous impact on the economic model. I think we're seeing in some fields some very early pilots where scholars who work in a particular educational area, discipline, are putting content together and making it openly available, or what's the right word? Whatever it costs to do it, to get that. In other words, it's not a profit model in work, but it's covering the cost of production.
Recovery.
Yeah, cost recovery. I think that the research data stuff has raised another suite of issues. I remember at Columbia when all this began to come to the table about 10 years ago, we decided to go around office by office in the science, engineering, and medical health sciences and ask the faculty, researchers, where's your research data? And a large percentage of them didn't know. A lot of them would go to their desk and open a drawer and say, well, it's on this thing. And floppies or hard disk or and so forth. And so it was very clear that they were not prepared as individuals to manage that. And so therefore institutions and national funding agencies had to step up to help deal with that. The fact is that most scholars, most researchers do not read a research paper for the first time in the published journal. That's a fact. They are part of networks of scholars and researchers on a global scale that move papers back and forth all the time, either pre-pub or post-pub, and that's the way they learn about new research that's being carried out around the world. And I saw a thing on 60 Minutes a few weeks ago about Watson, the IBM machine, and they did a test, and they compared how individual researchers performed in identifying new research and how Watson, it was actually the human researchers did a great job, but Watson did a better job. And so when you're dealing with severe illnesses or important scientific advancements, knowing everything can be important. And so I think we're going to see more machine-driven data and research gathering strategies. Whether it have the rigor and expense of a Watson, I don't know. But I do think that there is an expectation that there's better ways to find and discover new research than doing it by ourselves, or even relying on librarians.
Going back to your presentation this morning, you talked about information policy wars. Could you kind of summarize? We've already talked a little bit in light of your position at ALA next year, but just in general, how do you see all of this coming out? And could you give us a little bit more information on some of the various different sides or things that are driving?
Well, there's a number of things that are going to happen in the next Congress. We know that LSTA, which is the primary library funding legislation, is coming up for renewal. And we need to make sure that that's sustained and hopefully extended. in terms of new funding. We know that there's going to be a probably early attention to patent law rather than copyright law, and particularly with the vacancy in the Copyright Office. But we need to be prepared for efforts to rewrite American copyright, and that might be influenced by international developments. We know that telecommunications legislation is coming up for renewal and rewrite, and that's a very dynamic sphere. And so, and this whole continuing debate around network neutrality, which to me is an important social justice issue, actually, is going to lead to a lot of conversation and debate among the players. So I think there'll be a lot of things that will challenge us. National security has been an ongoing area of debate over the last, since 9/11, as it affects the ability of governments and security organizations to monitor what's going on, checking out books in libraries, searching databases and the internet in libraries, telephone conversations. The library community has always taken a very strong position in terms of intellectual freedom and privacy, and I think that's going to be a constant debate in our community. You know, we're not disloyal. We understand the importance of national security, but we also want to be sure that we don't violate the longstanding provisions of our Bill of Rights, which protect speech and protect privacy. So I think those are the types of things, and I think they take on a warlike character to some extent, because there's so much at stake in these areas.
And it's above and beyond libraries.
It is way beyond, and therefore I think libraries need to do several things. I actually skipped over this in my conversation this morning. We need to be knowledgeable about what's going on. We need to learn how to advocate and educate within our own communities. We need to be able to go into our state capitals, our national capital, and into international arenas and push for the types of legislation and laws, and take positions in court cases that will have an impact. We need to establish what might be really awkward coalitions with other companies and organizations that we normally would not spend time with.
Right.
But to advance these issues, we need to sort of hold our nose and get it done. And we've seen lots of examples of that over the years. So I think we need to be smarter as information policy boots on the ground, if you will, to try to deal with this next period. Now, obviously, next Tuesday we're going to know a lot more than we know today, not only in terms of who sits in the White House, but also what that congressional makeup will be. And I think that will drive a lot of these policy issues.
Another broader concern that you highlighted this morning is managing all this information and getting a control. And we're talking more about journals or books. I mean, somebody mentioned emails and videos. I mean, just a plethora.
I had a litany of 20 items.
Yeah, you did.
Yeah. So this is one of my things I've been marching around the world talking about. As I said, we've done a modest job with preserving our print and analog record. We've done a relatively poor job in protecting the things that exists in print or existed in print, which we've now made available digitally. E-journals, for example. We've created a couple of collaborative systems. One is called Portico, which sits under the Ithaca umbrella, and another which is Locks Clocks, which is a distributed model that Stanford played a very important role in advancing. In both cases, those two e-journal repository strategies, under 20% of e-journals are actually being captured and preserved. Wow. It depends on publishers contributing the content and libraries funding the repository. It's a dark repository. What it means is if somebody goes out of business or something becomes unavailable or it gets destroyed for some reason, there is a backup, and that backup is incomplete and it's inadequate. In ebook area, we're doing nothing. There's nothing. Now, there's a few ebooks that have trickled into these repositories, but this is a disaster, particularly when you think about the small publishers and the self-publishing that's going on, a large percentage of which is digital. It's not all digital, a lot of it's still print, but even there, I'm not sure what's going to happen to those print copies. But that's a huge, so I'm telling you, if we just sort of look at this published arena, we've got problems. But then when you add in all this other stuff,
Yeah.
I mean, it's huge. Social media,
It's
email.
overwhelming.
It's overwhelming.
It's just
It's
overwhelming.
overwhelming. And, I got pushback saying, well, we don't care. We don't need all that stuff. But we don't know if we need that stuff. And the fact is, we at Columbia, we had a series of Mellon grants to do some workflow and technology development and to do some case work. And we chose to go down the path of human rights, which was a big deal at Columbia in terms of education and research. And we started to collect tens of thousands of websites and web documents in the human rights area. And then we would discover that this stuff would change, disappear, go away. And so if somebody wanted to understand what was going on in human rights around the world, they would not be able to research it because the materials were not there. We also began to look at journals in particular disciplines, in looking at the references in the research papers, and identifying the growing number of references to born digital stuff of various kinds, and then trying to find those materials and not being able to a growing percentage. As I said this morning, it's an issue of integrity. If you're going to cite something, I should be able to look at it to know what you've argued and your conclusions are accurate. If I can't, then I have to question what you've done.
It's validating the research.
Exactly. And I think the same thing applies to doing research about our world. A growing amount of the evidence of what's going on in the world today, economic, social, political, is not in print. It's in a born digital setting.
Yeah.
And if we can't retain and make that material available, then we're going to have a hard time writing the history of this period. And then I talked about this issue of repository chaos, where I used to put my paper in one repository. It was the publisher repository. Now I put it on my website, I put it on the university repository, I put it in a disciplinary repository, a format repository, a national repository, et cetera, a research data repository, and so on. Which is the copy of record? Which one gets cited? Which one gets preserved? So these are really tough issues. And I don't have a solution.
Oh, it's going to keep us all busy.
I just don't think I just think we're not going to be able to deal with it institutionally.
It's much bigger than any one institution or any one profession, for that matter.
That's right. So we need to develop new strategies, and it's going to take money, because you have it's in some ways a collection development process. What are you going to capture and retain? You've got to be able to retrieve it, so you've got to have rigorous metadata type of capacity, and maybe machine-driven metadata will do that. And then you've got to have multiple backup copies, and you've got to refresh them. And you don't have to just preserve the content, you've got to preserve the functionality. Because if you look at a website, it's you navigate, and there's multimedia, and there's interactivity. And how do you preserve that?
Stuff.
We had a very important African American scholar give us at Columbia his archives. And in that archive was 15 years of email on 7 different email systems.
Wow.
And so what do you do with that? And one would argue that his interaction with his peers, and he worked in poetry, he worked in jazz, he worked in politics.
It's extremely important.
Extremely important. We're never going to understand his life and his impact unless we're able to make that email available to scholars
like
and
letters
students.
and correspondence
of the past.
Of the past. That's it. That's what
right.
it is. You gotta have it.
Manuscripts. I mean, how many authors would type multiple manuscripts until they got it right? And the handwritten notes on the sides and the margins, which are, that's what doctoral dissertations are built on.
That's right.
And now I'm not sure. I mean, do people retain their multiple copies? I suspect not.
No.
So are we rewriting the way disciplines will work by our failure to collect this stuff? Probably.
It's a big impact.
Yes, it is.
A big impact. A big impact. It's been interesting to listen to you talk because it shows that there's a need for libraries to try to exercise some power here.
Yes.
And try to exercise some influence.
That's correct.
And I was interested to hear you talk about ALA working with the Library of Congress, because those are the kinds of collaborations that we will probably need to
That's correct.
exercise the influence that we are going to need
Yeah.
to influence.
And I think
exercise.
ALA and OCLC and LC, I think OCLC can be a player here as an international organization. And I'm hoping that will be a part of this conversation as well.
Nancy, did you have anything else?
Well, just one last thing is that you're somebody who's always been a strong advocate, and it's going to be interesting as one of those new skills for the future. I think we're all going to have to be much more willing to step out of that traditional role and be willing to get out there and in some cases fight
Yes.
for what we believe in. And that isn't something that, I don't know how well that's really being taught, but in practice, I think for most librarians, that's sort of a takes you out of your comfort zone
Yes,
in
it
terms
does.
of your daily
Definitely.
I agree with
work.
that.
Definitely.
We do ALA Legislative Day every May, and bring people from every state into Washington and set up meetings for them with their Congress people and so forth. And we do training and workshops there. But this needs to be multiplied many times, because a lot of the work is not done in Washington, it's done in your city, in your
right.
county.
It's local.
And your state. And that's where a lot of the impact needs to be developed. And a lot of the leadership and advocacy needs to be advanced.
Jim, before we let you go, is there anything that we've missed? Is there any question that we should have asked you that we haven't?
You remember I cited History of the World Part 1. I think the opportunities are rich for the profession, and by the profession I'm casting it large in terms of the diversity of professionals that now are part of our work. I think national organizations like the Library of Congress, OCLC, American Library Association, and others need to step up in terms of the leadership that they provide and the coordination that they provide. We've seen other things happen with Digital Public Library of America, Hathi Trust, Digital Preservation Network, Duraspace, so lots of interesting combinations of professional players which are beginning to sort of unwrap some of these challenging issues. But when you look in at the local level of the library, I worry that there is so much duplication of effort. As I said this morning, why does every library have to have a acquisitions department, cataloging department, preservation department, digitization? Why can't we co-invest regionally in some of that? For the first time in history that I know it, Queens, Brooklyn, and New York public libraries are finding ways to work together. That was sort of like, oh my God, they're actually working together. But new leadership there has, I think, made a difference. Mayoral pressure, I think, was a factor. So I think there are different ways that we can sort of take care of what I call those mass production elements. The infrastructure requirements for the types of issues we've talked about today, I think we all have to co-invest in those. We can't build those at the local level. That's why Hathi and DPLA are so interesting, because of the national platforms that they represent.
They provide a model.
They provide a model. I agree.
And an example
Yes.
for people.
Yes. And I think that there are, I call it centers of excellence. Somebody pushed back at me this morning and said, how are we going to do all these things? Well, we don't need every library to have a copyright person. We could have a group of library-based copyright centers that would advise and work with. We don't need every library to have a web archiving program. We can co-invest and build those together. So I think we need to move it to the next level of collaboration. And I think that's one of the really important areas that I hope that we can work on over the next decade.
Well, you're somebody who's obviously the right man for the job here. You've got the passion, the experience, the
But I'm old.
knowledge.
I'm old. Yeah. So I really want to work with the next generation of professionals, people who are coming out of library education programs, people who are coming out of other professional fields, trying to create opportunities within the association and in other venues for the emerging leaders in our field, and to build an inclusive approach to the work of our profession.
Good luck.
Yes.
And congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah, congratulations on your being elected to ALA presidency, and we really appreciate you taking time out
No,
to come
I
and talk
enjoyed
to
it very
us.
much.
It was
Yeah.
it was a lot of fun, and of course we learned so much. So
Thank you.
thanks again.
Thank you.